Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. If you've seen my tiara video and my Valentine heart video recently, you'll know I've been loving embossed cookies. So what's an embossed cookie? It's a cookie that has a lot of texture and relief. It may be tinted, it may just be straight gingerbread, it may be the natural dough color, but it's pressed into a mold and either baked in the mold or not baked in the mold to create these wonderful shapes. They're kind of cool on their own. Bigger pressed cookies like this dahlia could be a standalone cookie. Just serve it on a plate and it's very, very special. It can make a nice embellishment to a single flat cookie. Or in the case of my mosaic box and also my Valentine's cookie, it can be used to dress up a much more three-dimensional construction. So lots of different ways to use these. I did touch briefly on how I made them in my tiara video, but I don't think I got into great detail there. So by popular request, I'm going to talk about how I form my cookies and what my preferred methods of forming them are. I'm going to show you different ways of forming them, and I'm going to talk about the pluses and minuses of the various methods. So this is very much a technique video. We won't be putting together a particular cookie project, but I think it will inform your use of this particular technique going forward. These are all done with tinted sugar cookie dough of various colors. And here's just a plain gingerbread dough put into a different type of mold. I use these on my tiaras. So first off, I want to talk about the types of molds you might use and which ones work better than others. Then I'm going to talk about how you impart color to the dough if it's a sugar cookie dough. There are ways to do that before baking and there are ways to do it after. Then I want to talk about the types of doughs that work, which work better than the others. And lastly, I'll wrap up with different methods of forming these and baking these. So first of all, types of molds. I've got classic spring-early molds, which are wooden or rosin. Classic old traditional ones are made of wood. These are probably a rosin of some sort. They're not particularly oven-proof, nor are they pliable at all. So these are typically used for pressing into rolled cookie dough. There are also rolling pin versions of these that you roll over sheets of rolled cookie dough. So you would handle these in a very different way than some of my silicone molds, which I'm more prone to using now. I find the silicone molds are a lot more versatile and they allow for in-mold baking, which I tend to prefer. Different types of silicone molds. This is silicone. It's oven resistant up to about 400 or 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So this can go in the oven. It's not as pliable as some other silicone molds. So I tend to use this mold in perhaps a different way than I might use these more pliable silicone molds. The molds also come in various depths. This is pretty shallow. These rose molds, which were used to make these flowers, are pretty darn deep, but very, very pliable. And again, this is oven proof. It can either be used to shape dough outside of the oven or you can bake in it. And same is true of this very, very deep heart mold. Very, very pliable, same material as this. Now pliability is key because if you're shaping the dough outside of the oven and not baking in it, it's much more easy to get the dough out of it because it's bendable than something like this, and certainly than something like this. However, if you're baking in oven, pliability is less of a factor, as you'll soon see. So those are a range of different molds you might use, and we're going to be working mostly with silicone molds throughout the rest of this video. Let's turn now to the types of doughs that you can use. I say, why reinvent the wheel? Why not work with doughs that you use for making normal cookies for making these? So that's what I do. I work with my gingerbread recipe, which you'll find in the link below. I work with my sugar cookie dough recipe, which has slightly more butter in it than this particular recipe, and thus it spreads more and also has more leavening in it. So it tends to spread more than my gingerbread dough, which will be important later. And you can also tint your sugar cookie dough. This medium pink was achieved by putting about 3 drops of my liquid gel food coloring that I normally tint my royal icing with into about 5½ ounces of dough. And I'll show you how to tint in a moment. But let's talk about these two different doughs. Why is the composition important? The two key things that are important when doing molded cookie doughs are the type of fat, be it shortening or butter, the ratio of fat to dry ingredients, and also the amount of leavening relative to everything else. So generally speaking, the less leavening relative to everything else, so the lower the proportion of baking soda or baking powder, the less fat relative to everything else, the less likely the cookies are to spread. So the more success you would have with creating an imprint and then pulling off the mold and then putting the cookie in the oven. But if you're working with a dough that's highly spreadable, that has a lot of butter in it, like my sugar cookie dough, and a lot of leavening, you're going to have much more success baking in mold, because when you bake in mold, the cookie dough cannot spread at all. So, just be aware of the different qualities of your recipe and how they might affect the baking of the dough if you're baking out of mold. It's not so much an issue if you're baking in mold. I can work with both, and we're going to work with both today. Oftentimes I will, if I'm baking out of mold, reduce the leavening by quite a lot. I might take it out altogether, and that will reduce spread too. So that's a possibility. What I'm going to turn to now is how to impart color to molded cookies. So before baking, if you want color in a molded cookie, as in all of these, you work with a light colored dough to start. So I'm going to work with my sugar cookie dough, and I'm going to add food coloring to it. Okay, so tinting dough, you could knead it in on your work surface as you would knead bread dough, but it makes a mess and your hands get all dirty. So what I prefer to do is work in my electric mixer with the paddle attachment, the heavy duty attachment, because the dough is really thick. So this is about 3 drops of food coloring in the 5.5 ounces. And I'm just going to show you how that mixes up here, and then we'll go a little bit darker with it as well, so you can see the range of color you can get. You can get it just about as dark as you want, just by adding more food coloring. Whoops, I put a big squirt in there. I don't know how much that was. It came out suddenly, so we're just going to see what that does. I start kind of gradually just to get it incorporated. And then I'll increase the speed just as much as I can so that the dough doesn't fly out of the bowl until it's a nice uniform color. And this just keeps the hands a lot cleaner. Okay, that actually looks pretty well mixed. I probably had slightly more pink than I had in that other one. It's showing a lot more pink. But if you don't like the kind of yellowish cast that it might have, let me add a couple more drops and we'll just see what that does, just so you can get a sense, because I didn't squeeze so carefully last time. So I'm going to add another 3 drops. 1, 2, 3, and that'll give you a sense of the range that a small amount of food coloring, again, this is a concentrated food coloring. You don't want to use normal liquid food colorings from the grocery store. You want to use a concentrated liquid gel or gel coloring. That'll give you more bang for the drop. Okay, so you'll see it darkened it up somewhat, not hugely, but I've got 5 or 6 drops of food coloring in here, no doubt. And because the dough, my sugar cookie dough, has a yellowish cast to it, the pink won't show kind of true to the color itself. It'll be a little bit more yellow once I add it to the dough. So if you don't want that, here's a light pink that was baked. It's got kind of a brownish cast. Here's one to which I added white food coloring. And the white food coloring obviously makes it a little bit lighter. It diminishes that yellow cast, and it also, to some extent, toughens the dough. It seems to make it a little bit more firm, which is nice for unmolding it from the molds, as you'll see later. So I'm going to drop just a couple drops of my white coloring. I've got Wilton here, and we'll just see what that does. I'm going to put 3 drops of that in too. So you could mix different colors to get different shades, so you don't have to use strictly one color. So slightly more white. Let's go ahead and add it, and the texture is still pretty similar to what it was before. I'm going to add a healthy dose now. Let's do 5 drops and see what that does. Whoops, that's more than 5 because it just dribbled out. Let's see what that does. I think you'll see what I'm wanting to show is a significant whitening, but also somewhat a change in texture. You know, now the dough seems to be pulling away from the sides of the bowl more than it was before. It's a little less sticky, and I think you'll see it's kind of holding together more in one big blob. That's what I mean about the toughening effect of the whitener, and it may be also a function of me just beating it more too, though I think it has to do more with the whitener, because I've beaten just as long without whitener, and it hasn't done quite that. So it eliminates that yellowish cast that you see in the other dough. Now we're going to talk about different ways to mold. I mentioned before in-oven mold baking and pressing into the dough beforehand, releasing the mold, and then putting the dough into the oven. I refer to those as in mold and out of mold forming. Those are the 2 basic ways. And there are different conditions under which you might use each one. If you don't have a lot of molds and you need to do a ton of these molded cookies, then you really don't have the luxury of baking them all in mold because you'd be forever trying to recycle the same mold. Or if you're working with, so that might be one reason to pop the dough out of the molds or press the molds into the dough and then bake in the oven. Another reason you might want to do out of mold baking is when you know you have a dough that doesn't spread very much and you're not going to get a very different result if you were to bake in mold versus out of mold. Again, there will be no spreading whatsoever if you bake within mold. So those are the kind of the different reasons why you might do that. I tend to always prefer to bake in mold because I get much more distinct results, and I'll show you a little example of that further. But let's just suppose, for purposes of argument, that you don't have the luxury of necessarily baking in mold all the time. So for out of mold forming, there are two different ways to pack. You can put the dough in and then release it by pushing it out of the mold, and this is where it's helpful to have a really flexible mold. However, when the dough is soft like this is, or has a high butter content like my sugar cookie dough, you can't always get it out of these really deeply recessed molds. That's another reason why I prefer in-mold baking. I don't have to worry about popping it out and distorting the impression. But I just want to show you this because you might find yourself in a position where you need to do that. So what we're going to do here to make it easier to come out is we're going to pack a little bit in. I'm going to chill this in the fridge for a bit, and you'll see that it pops out much more easily. I'm also going to pack a little bit of sugar cookie dough in some of these other recesses too. My sugar cookie dough is even softer than my gingerbread, so if you thought that one was sticky, this is going to be even stickier because it's got a higher butter content. But I'm going to try to put these both in the freezer or fridge, and hopefully we'll see that they pop out much more easily once they've been chilled for a couple of minutes. Certainly not very long if put in the freezer. Okay, so while that's chilling, I'm going to show an out of mold method that works well in shallow molds and to some extent in some of these deeper molds. And that involves, rather than popping the dough out of the mold, it involves pressing the mold into the dough. Slight subtlety, but sometimes easier to control it this way than it is by popping it out. And a lot has to do with the depth of the mold. Obviously, you'll have to chill the dough more to get it out of a really deep mold, and you'd have to really mound up the dough here to press into a deep mold to make sure you got the full impression. So I've rolled this maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. The thickness depends on the depth of the mold. If my mold is really deep, it's going to need to be higher. Here I've got a really shallow mold, and I find that the thinner it is, actually, the better the impression I get. I've lightly dusted with flour. Hopefully it won't stick in the mold. I don't always need to do that, but my dough is a little bit soft right now. Pressing in and then lifting away, I get a really nice imprint. But obviously, there's still a lot of dough around it. So in this case, I've got the kind of tedious task of cutting around it before it goes into the oven. You could also do this after it comes out of the oven, but I like to pull it away now because then it allows more space for more cookies on the tray. So pull all that aside, and that would go in the oven and then bake like so. Now I can spend a little more time cleaning this up by trimming a little closer and in between each of these little mini leaves, but for purposes of this video, I'm not going to do that. You can see I've got a nice impression before it goes into the oven, though this going into the oven without the mold around it is going to spread a little bit, and I think you'll see that later. The advantage of this technique is now this one single mold that I have is freed up for me to do many more on the same cookie tray before it goes in the oven, as opposed to me sticking that in, waiting for that to bake and popping it out. We're going to go ahead and grab those roses that were in the freezer for a couple of minutes and see if they unmold any more easily now that they've been chilled, and I think they will. Okay, so we just popped these out of the freezer. They're in there for a couple of minutes. Hopefully that was enough time. We'll see. I'm going to start by popping out the gingerbread. Now, this mold's flexible, so it allows me to do this. I'd have a much harder time popping anything out of this less flexible mold. So this is really only possible for flexible molds. And there it comes out, actually pretty nicely. Some distortion. I broke that edge, but not bad. Try to get another one out. And you'll see I'm just kind of bending the mold. And I lost a little bit of that edge, so that's not great, but I might be able to patch it together. And let's see if the sugar cookie dough does any better or worse. Now this is the sugar cookie dough where I added the whitener, so it's a little stiffer than the sugar cookie dough without. But it didn't come out very well. So we're going to give that even more time in the freezer and try popping that out, maybe at the very end of the video, and see if it does any better. So while that's chilling up a little bit longer, I'm going to talk about in-mold baking methods, and then we're going to compare the results of each. So I'm going to repeat the same leaf, but we're going to bake it in that particular mold. And to do that, I just press it in. This is my preferred method of doing it. It eliminates the hassle of trying to bend things out and distorting the shape when you try to pop it out of the mold. And it will not spread at all. You'll get the cleanest possible imprint you can imagine. So I press it in. Sometimes I roll a rolling pin over it. It doesn't matter. And I'll clean up the edge a little bit, but I'll end up trimming a little bit more when it comes out of the oven. And we'll pop those in the oven. My normal baking temperature is 375 for both of my doughs until it's firm on the back and lightly browned. The other advantage of baking in molds is the silicone acts as a buffer next to the pan. So you're much less likely to burn really thinly molded cookies, very thin ones, than when they're in the mold than when they're on the sheet. And I think you'll see this in some of the results that I'm going to show you in a moment. So I'm going to stick these in for the normal baking time, give them a watch. Around mid-baking, I will pat down. If these puff at all in mold, I'll pat them down with the back of a spatula to press them in the mold, and that I find gives a slightly crisper imprint if I press them down mid-baking. I don't press these down or I'll wreck the imprint. So while those are baking, I'm going to show you some ones I baked yesterday just to make some of the points that I've been making verbally more clear in imagery. And some of these I've baked in mold, and the other two I've baked out of mold using the two different shaping methods. Here you'll see ones that I molded by pressing them out, and these are the ones that were baked out of mold by pressing the mold into the dough. So only a slight distinction here between these two rows in my opinion. I think I see more distortion in the actual shape typically when I pop it out of the mold because I'm really having to bend it back to get that mold to extricate the dough from the mold. So this rose ended up really wide, whereas the one that I pressed in was more the true shape of the mold. So slight difference there. The most notable difference though is the degree of spread. Here's one baked in mold, no spread whatsoever. This one baked out of mold rose a little bit, and you lost the distinction of texture. In the gingerbread, that's my least spreading dough. It has no butter in it, just shortening, and less leavening than my sugar cookie dough. Here are the results with the sugar cookie dough. In mold, again, a lot of distinction. Out of mold, it didn't seem to spread actually as much as my gingerbread for whatever reason, but it's definitely less distinct than the in mold baking. The other thing you'll notice is I wasn't keeping a watchful eye on the out of mold ones, and in a flash this one burned and changed color. So I have a lot more latitude. It just takes longer to actually really discolor anything in a silicone mold because you've got that layer of silicone mold between the hot metal baking pan. So I hope that makes some of the distinctions very, very clear between the types of methods of shaping and baking. Okay, we're going to talk about after methods of adding color to cookies. So a couple of comparisons here. Just to recap, you can tint the dough beforehand, and this is an example of tinted sugar cookie dough without the whitener, and you can see it has kind of a yellowish cast. And here I added some whitener to this little bow. It lightened it up, but it also kind of eliminates any of that yellow hue, so that's something you might want to consider before baking. After baking, there are a couple of different techniques you can use, and these are just three that I commonly use. I'm sure there are more. One is a sponging technique where you just apply color to the top of the relief. As I've done on these pieces, I've just got gold on the high points. The inner lower points are still the natural gingerbread color. These are sprayed, same basic shapes as those here, but I've sprayed them with a luster spray so it's coloring even the deep recesses of the gingerbread. And you could spray in any color. I happen to use gold a lot. And then here, I've taken a plain tinted sugar cookie with whitener in it, and I've given it a totally different look by dusting it with a little bit of dry petal dust to create a dark center. And I'm going to show you quickly how to do each of those. So for sponging, I'm working with a gold luster dust in this little palette, and I'm just going to put a little bit of fresh dust here. For sponging, I like to turn my dust into a paint, and I do that by extending it with a little bit of extract. And alcohol-based anything, it could be straight alcohol, will also extend it into a paint, but these dusts are typically not water soluble, so that will not work. Just stir it together a little bit, and then using a sponge brush rather than a paintbrush, I just dab it on the surface. A bristle brush will tend to go deeper into the cavities, and you may end up coloring more of the dough than you would like. So here I'm just able to get the high points, and I think that looks pretty darn cool. So that's a simple sponging technique. Dusting as opposed to painting, I refer to that as the application of dry dust to a dry cookie without the addition of any of that extract. Just take a little dust on the end of my paintbrush. I knock off the excess often because otherwise I can get a really heavy load. If I just want a slight blush, that's really nice. On this one I added a lot more dust and I got a much more heavy accent. So you can even control the degree of shading just by how much dust you apply to the end of the brush. So that's a simple dusting technique. And then let's do a quick spray of this piece and we'll just compare it to the one that I just sponged. Here I'm working with a luster spray and I'm working with a new brand that I just discovered when I was traveling in Italy recently. It's a Pavoni, P-A-V-O-N-I, Italian brand of luster spray, which I love because it's super shiny. So I'm just going to get it started over here and then just give it a, I like to use a circular motion just to spread it evenly. And that's enough. That clearly has gone into all the recesses in a way that this one has not. It's got a slightly more yellow cast, I think, than the other gold powder. So experiment with your powders and your dusts and your sprays because they all have a slightly different hue, even if they're called the same thing. So we just covered 3 different ways of adding color accents afterwards: sponging, dusting, and spraying. Now I'm going to go check on those cookies that I put in the oven to see how they baked up relative to one another, and we'll lastly check on those that were in the freezer to see if we can unmold them more easily. Okay, I've got those gingerbread out of the oven. I just want to point out a couple of things. Again, this points to the distinction between out of mold and in mold baking. These were all in the oven for the same period of time, and those baked out of mold, particularly these thinner roses, tended to get almost burned in the same amount of time that this one in mold was sort of barely brown around the edge. One thing I did do mid-baking was I pressed down, as I said, with my offset spatula just to press out the dome that had formed. I find that gives a much nicer imprint. I'm going to let that cool for a couple of minutes just until I can easily handle the mold without it retains a lot of heat for a while, until I can flip that out. And then I think you'll see quite clearly real time. I showed you the example on the board earlier, but I did want to demonstrate that in fact this does work real time as well, that this piece will be much more distinct. So that just pops out really nicely. In a shallow mold I can just flop it over and it falls out. With a deeper mold like those roses, I would actually have to peel it back the way I'm going to peel the raw dough out of those molds that we're going to check next. So I think you can see here much more definition than the one that baked out of mold. So this is generally always my preference. And all those pieces that I sponged earlier were baked in mold. We've got this out of the freezer. Now I've just got sugar cookie in here. I hadn't packed with gingerbread. And these are feeling really firm to the touch, so I'm hoping they come right out. But again, I have to gently peel back the mold. And this is what I would have to do if I had baked nicely. Remember how before they had smudged? So it is quite possible to press them out of the mold. If you have a shortage of molds, you might want to do this, because then you can immediately reuse this. However, as I said before, I most often bake in mold, and in fact, all of these cookies baked up here were in mold baking for the maximum definition, because these would spread once in the heat of the oven. So that's my little primer, my 101, if you will, on embossed cookies. We covered everything from types of molds to types of doughs to coloring techniques both before and after baking, and different methods for shaping and baking. If you have any other questions in terms of how to work with these cookies, by all means do email me and I will be sure to answer your questions. Till next video, live sweetly.